Unlike a lot of my peers, and I'm probably insulting them by calling them peers, I do not rush out and buy a new console the very first second that it's available. Anymore. A console has to lure me in with a killer app, a game that demands that I move to the next console generation kicking and screaming because I simply have to play it. For the PlayStation 4, that game was Batman Arkham Knight, and for the PlayStation 5, that game was Insomniac's Marvel's Spider-Man 2, the hotly anticipated sequel to one of the best Spider-Man games ever made. Insomniac's Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4 was a phenomenal title, but it definitely had room for improvement. Its story felt like it wasn't written for an actual video game, for how many times it falls out of the sky dead so that nothing can happen, and the smaller scale follow-up game Spider-Man Miles Morales was, at least to me, just kind of forgettable. I made a whole episode about that game, and I do not remember how it played, or most of the story past the major plot points. So making a sequel to Insomniac's beloved first Spider-Man game is a daunting task, but not an insurmountable one. So with a brand new platform and twice the Spider-Man to work with, how does Marvel's Spider-Man 2 pan out? I make it a point not to spoil a review subject if the game is brand new, but I do consider it fair game if it happens early on or if it was already spelled out in trailers, or in today's case, prior games post-credit scenes. I'll talk about the story first, and if you want to go in completely blind, here's a time code. So let's dive in. The game opens with one hell of a story hook. Kraven the Hunter, a superhuman that got bored with hunting animals and started hunting people, decides to head to New York to start hunting Spider-Man's supervillains. And this version of Kraven has both the resources of a country and a cult of trained hunters numbering in the several hundreds. I mean, I've seen cults around dumber weirdos, so Kraven's hunt results in a full army of whack jobs tearing the city apart chasing already dangerous supervillains. Making them even more dickish and making Kraven a fantastically hateable villain is that most of their targets are villains that have reformed and are trying to start a new life, lest you'd be tempted to sit back and let Kraven go nuts. Co-Spider-Men Peter Parker and Miles Morales have to stop Kraven while chasing down and trying to save as many villains as they can. But as these tend to go, they each have their own problems. Both Peter and Miles are letting Spider-Man completely dominate their lives. Peter can't hold down a day job, and Miles can't write a college entrance essay because he doesn't know who he is without Spider-Man. Miles has it worse when Mr. Negative, the villain that killed his father, is one of the villains freed by Kraven, dredging up deep traumas and driving him to run himself ragged out of desperation and fear for his loved ones. And Peter's life is thrown for a loop when Harry Osborn, his best friend who was conspicuously absent in the first game, suddenly comes back into his life. Harry was sick with an incurable disease, but he's got a miracle cure in this universe's version of the black suit. And as dictated in the canon events of Spider-Man before him, Peter eventually gets the black suit, it makes him stronger but also more violent, the suit turns his life upside down, and it gives rise to the supervillain Venom, making a bad situation so much worse. Incidentally, Venom's introduction is so damn thrilling in the game, it feels like a giant apology for how toned down and wussy his movies are. Maybe Kraven's depiction is a preemptive apology for the Aaron Taylor Johnson movie. My biggest problem with Insomniac's first Spider-Man game was how meandering and scattershot the story was. It took forever for the plot to get going between multiple pit stops to set up Miles and to give MJ stealth missions and to slowly tease out Mr. Negative's backstory and to check in on Aunt May's day job and constantly stopping to slowly build up Doc Ock, not to mention how jarring the shift was when Ock usurped Mr. Negative as the main villain. Here, the plot gets moving and it stays moving for most of the game. There's about a half-hour flashback to set up Harry and Peter's friendship that's largely superfluous, and there's a sequence sticking around at a fair. There's one awkward cut from Peter trying to track down one of the villains to Miles just kind of screwing around for a side quest. But those aside, the plot feels excellently paced with major developments and suspense throughout. I would majorly slack on the side quest through most of the game because I was perpetually eager to get to the next story mission above all else. And it's a much smoother transition when Venom usurps the main villain role because the Black Suit arc is actually woven into the Kraven arc for the entire game. There are lots of emotional moments in the story as well as familiar franchise plot beats being given a satisfying new spin. One particular favorite sequence of mine is the multiple set pieces involving the Lizard. They do a great job building up the Lizard as both a tragic figure and a horror movie monster, and as the encounter drags on, it's revealed just how far gone Peter's already gotten, when he completely runs out of fucks to give in mid-boss fight.
You're too weak to get control back, aren't you? No wonder your family left you!
It really was a brilliant idea to just cut Eddie Brock out of the Venom story, because making Harry into Venom makes him a far more tragic figure with way more emotional resonance and stakes than the character usually has. And take notes, DC, this is how you cast Tony Todd as an iconic supervillain.
Look at us! We are healthy, strong. This is what you wanted, isn't it?
There are a few plot points that I wish had been a little more fleshed out, though. Peter's motivation for clinging so hard to the black suit isn't explained or even hinted at until hours after it stops being relevant. The black suit stuff is still compelling as hell since it incorporates real-world themes of addiction. I just think some key scenes would have been even better if we had context before instead of after. Also, part of Harry's breaking point as his story winds down is a scene of his dad being super doting on Peter in a moment of stress, when it's never been hinted a single time that Harry was having this kind of rivalry. Black Cat shows up for one really fun level, then she escapes the city, which is a nice use of the character to make the universe feel bigger even if it's not in a major role. And then she comes back for a handful of voice lines only to never be mentioned again. Why did you establish that she was back if she never factors in again? Venom's plan revolves around a super vague MacGuffin that's never explained and just kind of drives the plot through magic, I guess, which feels really jarring. And you'll probably be able to predict a major late-game plot twist just by looking at the upgrade trees for 2 seconds. Also, for as solid as the story generally is, once Venom enters the picture, the story feels way too rushed, with a storyline that I've seen done stellar elsewhere just kind of blown through without taking adequate time to build up or marinate properly. The arc isn't bad, it just could easily, well, be greater, as the game's tagline goes. The rushed third act, unfortunately, is a symptom of a bigger problem that I'll get into later. Also, apparently people are mad that Black Cat is bisexual in this universe, and I'm like, why? Since when is a hot woman in skin-tight leather, who's a master thief that knows her way around rope and duct tape, who likes making out with other women on top of that, and this is a mental image that inspires rage in you? You'd rather it be like the 90s cartoon where she ends up with friggin' Morbius?
Intriguing.
Alright, so the story is a major improvement on Insomniac's first Spider-Man game, trims the fat, gets right to the point, and keeps itself moving throughout. A little too hard at times, but whatever. But how does it play as an actual video game? Ever since the movie licensed Spider-Man 2 revolutionized the franchise, the defining trait of Spider-Man games has been the open-world web swinging. You navigate the city with a series of carefully controlled web swings off buildings, web zips to pull yourself to and launch off of mounting points, and mid-air acrobatics. It's always been thrilling, but here, like Insomniac's prior offerings, it's made even more exciting by incorporating a sense of momentum. If you go long enough without crashing into a wall or you pull off certain tricky maneuvers, you can build up a ridiculous amount of speed and friggin' blaze through the city. It's basically building up a strong combo and then keeping it going for as long as possible, and that satisfaction crossed with the sheer speed of traversal and the agony of clipping a building and screeching to a halt. It's a fantastic and engrossing navigation system. This game adds in a new mechanic and a set of web wings that allow you to glide at high speed, and I'm of two minds on this addition. On one hand, the city is bigger and has a lot of open areas without so much to swing from, making the wings a good stopgap that increases the feeling of freedom. But on the other hand, the wings let you ride air currents to traverse the city so quickly that they can render the actual web swinging obsolete in a friggin' Spider-Man game. I could say the same for the fast travel system, handy for reaching objectives nigh instantaneously, but renders the franchise's signature mechanic nearly pointless. But my favorite part of the web swinging is they finally brought back the super jump, which lets you begin swings by launching yourself about a mile into the air, which I've always loved playing around with. The game also demonstrates the power of the PlayStation 5 in some really impressive ways, loading up a mission, spawning into the game world, fast traveling to a completely different chunk of the map, or loading back after dying. It all happens within a matter of a few seconds, which is damned impressive. You can even switch between the game's two playable characters, Peter and Miles, virtually any time between missions, and it's pretty much seamless and instantaneous. I'm gonna have to try Doom 2016 on PlayStation 5 and see if it chops down those abusive load times. And yes, you heard that right. You have 2 playable characters now. Both Peter and Miles are co-protagonists, and you can freely switch between them at any time as long as you're not in the middle of a mission. The first caveat there is that some of the levels can only be played as one or the other, like tending to Peter's new day job or helping Miles' classmates with their bullshit. The second caveat is that Peter and Miles play 95% the same! They have the same movement, the same combat moves, the same swinging and navigation speed and techniques, the same gadgets, and they share a major upgrade tree. Literally the only differences between them are their loadouts of super moves. One-off attacks that you get to use every several minutes, like a super punch or explosion man. And even then, aside from Miles having lightning-themed attacks and Peter having black suit-themed attacks, I don't even think the super moves are that distinct. Miles' lightning just felt marginally more satisfying to use, so I tended to favor him. It's so sad that Web of Shadows made the red and black suits feel completely distinct in combat for different gameplay styles, but over a decade later, I can barely tell 2 completely different characters apart, especially when individualism is supposed to be Miles' entire character spiel. Oh, I'm sorry, there is one more difference between the 2 Spider-Men. Miles can turn invisible, which you will never, ever use because stealth is a complete joke in this game. Peter and Miles also each have a rage meter that fills up as you fight. Peter's rage meter lets you invincibly pound through entire groups of enemies regardless of weaknesses, and Miles' Venom Burst instantly recharges all your focus meters and super meters, which in turn refill the Venom Burst on their own so that you can execute an endless loop of raising everything to dust with lightning storms and instant takedowns. Both burst meters utterly break the game, which is good, because hands down the biggest problem holding this game back for me is the combat pissed me off! You spend a lot of time fighting nothing but Kraven's hunters. They have basic melee dudes, basic ranged dudes, and some dipshit ranged dudes that hang on walls so you just have to fire a few webs for a gift-wrapped instant takedown, and bird drones that are the most stock flying enemies ever. If someone has a shield or a weapon, then they're immune to punches, but not immune to webs or supers or uppercuts, so it hardly matters. I will say the sheer quantity of enemies and the narrow window that you're given to dodge damage does kind of force you to focus on taking down enemies quickly to thin the herds. It adds a sense of urgency to the combat that I liked, but those are still all reused basic enemies from the first game, so what's new here? The hunters use beasts that emit pulses that disable your gadgets and special moves, which is actually pretty neat. The hunters will throw grenades that keep you out of a single small area temporarily, which is a minor inconvenience at worst. The main new mechanic is the parry system. Every now and then a hunter will attempt a heavy attack that cannot be dodged. You have to push the left bumper to parry the attack or else you still take the damage! See how many people get that reference? Anyway, I personally found the parry system to be a giant pain in the ass. You see the prompt that you need to dodge, and then after your reflexes have already kicked in, you see a second prompt that says, oh shit, you were supposed to push a different button, and now you're hit. It's not helped that the AI is deliberately designed to dogpile on you. If you take a hit, the douche canoe that hit you will not only keep launching attacks, but he'll embolden the other enemies to go for it too, leading to a failure cascade where you take a shitload of damage in rapid succession. Don't get me wrong, the Batman Arkham games do a lot of these same things in their combat, but Arkham gives you more reaction time, there's more immediate differentiation in the attack prompts, and you have way more instant takedowns for the problematic enemies. But whatever, the parry system is annoying, but what other mechanics do they have added to the new game?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
They had exactly one new idea and they ran it into the ground. Every new enemy and every boss fight revolves around the goddamned parry mechanic. They introduced a new enemy type called Shield Brutes. Shield Brutes are immune to everything except for parrying their attacks to make them vulnerable. Then they add in Sword Brutes. Sword Brutes are immune to everything except for parrying their attacks to make them vulnerable. For the third act, they added new enemies called Behemoths. Behemoths are immune to everything except for parrying their attacks to make them vulnerable. And if you haven't mastered the parries by then, your only recourse is to spam super moves, rage meters, and gadgets until the animate piles of shit finally go down! Oh, is that not enough parrying for you? Well, then you'll be happy to know that every single damn boss in the game works the same way. Over and over again, each boss fight goes, dodge attacks until you can parry something and then go in for damage. And every damned boss fight stretches on for 3 to 4 near identical phases just to rub in how basic and repetitive the combat is. It's really fortunate that a lot of these boss battles have intense emotional resonance and sky-high narrative stakes behind them, because on gameplay they suck balls! Especially since most every boss in the game only gives you a tiny fraction of a second to land a dodge. I basically had to die twice until I had memorized every boss's attack animations, because the spider sense on its own can be near useless. So yeah, combat revolves almost exclusively around a single new mechanic that I didn't like. It just boggles my mind how much they completely blew it in this department. Actually, that's not entirely fair. They do toss in one other new enemy type near the end of the game called nimble enemies. They die to a single web shot. I'm not kidding. You mow them down like Rambo through commies. It's quite pathetic. Even the gadgets feel homogenized and repetitive. I like that they streamlined the gadget system into 4 quick-fire button combos. But all the gadgets do the same damn thing. You have the web shooters, which can web enemies to walls for instant takedowns and which upgrade to give you all kinds of perks. But the other 4 gadgets? The upshot stuns a group of enemies. The web grabber stuns a group of enemies. The ricochet web stuns a group of enemies. The concussion grenade knocks enemies back until it gets upgraded to stun a group of enemies. Also, the concussion grenade... It just feels like any strategy to combat has gone out the window. If you run into something you can't punch through, just start hucking gadgets and super moves and you will clear it. It barely seems to matter which gadgets or supers, just use whatever's not on cooldown. And you're probably remembering about now that they also had stealth sections in the last 2 games, so are they any better? I can count the number of actual stealth sections in this game on my fingers, and there's no penalty for screwing them up. If you get caught, it just turns into another normal-ass combat section identical to all the others, and doing these parts as combat is faster. Prior games at least had some encounters that failed you for getting caught, but not anymore. Hostage-taking is apparently a lost art form in the Insomniac universe. They did add in one new mechanic for that stealth that you barely do, though. You can fire web lines to build your own tightropes and go anywhere that you want. Cough! It's impressive that the PlayStation 5 hardware can track all this new terrain that you build on the fly, since your tightropes don't disappear over time, but being able to set up the much more powerful perch takedowns anywhere and anytime that you want feels more than a little busted. But then the stealth is pointless anyway, so who cares? And speaking of stealth, the first of these games also had story missions where you played as Mary Jane, interrupting the main campaign to really tediously sneak around enemies and die instantly if you got caught. Those Mary Jane stealth missions do make a return, but there are only 2 of them. They're actually placed carefully to increase the tension of the story at key moments, and you've got a taser that actually lets you fight the enemies and play aggressively. They're actually pretty fun. And before you rush in to tell me that there are 3 Mary Jane stealth levels, the third one is just a straight-up third-person shooter, stealth be damned. It's like they were so laser-focused on fixing the problems from the first game that everything else just kind of fell by the wayside. Oh, and I know I'm gonna get comments. The main internet loudmouth discourse on this game is that the Mary Jane model looks ugly, apparently. I think she looks fine. She looks like a realistic, attractive woman. I'm still pissed that they changed Peter's face model into a weird babyface, uncanny-ass melting wax sculpture of Tom Holland when his face in the original release of the first game looked perfectly fine. What, did you all see the mockery of the Avengers game for looking like MCU stunt doubles and just lean into it? What the hell? They have a whole bucket load of costumes to unlock in the gameplay once again, and Miles' wardrobe looks badass, especially once you finish the Mysterio side quest. But Peter's costumes, I was unimpressed. A lot of them just look way too samey to his default look, when the first game had way more variety and off-the-wall designs. Though it worked out because it led to me just leaving the black suit equipped for the entirety of the arc to roleplay and increase my immersion. For the record, my favorite Peter suit is the sleek new blue, my favorite Miles suit is the Shadow Spider that looks like something out of Assassin's Creed, and what in the name of hell is this abomination that they make Miles wear for the final boss fight? For an artist, the man does not have good taste. I've heard this suit was actually a tie-in with a sneaker company. Yeah, good job selling something that looks butt-fugly. I was also really underwhelmed with the game's side missions. The Prowler, Spiderbot, and Sandman quests are all collectathons, just with a remedial puzzle or extremely brief combat encounter thrown in. The Foundation missions are mostly just a collection of brief minigames with little to no depth to them. Peter has a side quest involving a cult, and Miles has to track down missing museum instruments. Those amount to a grand total of about 6 extra story missions, and that's kind of it. Miles' classmates and the Civilian app give you quests that amount to rock-simple puzzles and scavenger hunts, maybe 1 or 2 actual navigation challenges among them. There are hunter strongholds and nests that give you the big combat encounters like in prior games, and they're pretty engaging. And then there are craven robot birds that you chase by flying through rings. Cough! But that's kind of where the side content ends, and against the wealth and wide variety of side objectives from the last 2 games, it's kind of like, is that it? In place of the challenges from Taskmaster, Screwball, or etc., they have the Mysteriums, challenges put together by the supposedly reformed Mysterio. They look amazing and they have a really cool payoff, but here's the thing. Every single Mysterium is a combat challenge! Whereas the prior games also had stealth and traversal challenges that made the most out of lesser utilized gameplay mechanics and maintained the extreme sport vibes that made this traversal method so addicting and alluring to some players. And some of the Mysteriums are so easily exploited, it makes me wonder how hard they were play tested. One challenge has you throw enemies off a building within a time limit, which sounds challenging and creative until you think for about 5 seconds and find a way to exploit it. Just jump off the side of the building and web pull people off the edge one at a time. Easy peasy. Or the challenges where you have to land finishers on enemies when a fully upgraded Miles can hand that shit out like Halloween candy. The Mysteriums are cool, just disappointing when you look at what came before. Also, one interesting footnote, when you complete the Spiderbot side quest, you meet this random bar woman named Delilah who has never been mentioned in anything before and means exactly nothing to you. She was supposed to be in Across the Spider-Verse, but she was cut, and the dev team likely didn't get anywhere near enough heads up to fix their one big Spider-Verse shout-out that was cut from the movie. Like, ouch, that's just bad luck on that one. Spider-Man 2 has a lot of red flags pointing to it being rushed. You could argue whether the combat is shallow or the story is rushed, and whether those came out the way the dev team intended or not, but there are several missing features from prior games. Biggest and most glaring is that there's no New Game Plus mode at launch, which has become a staple for the genre. And sure, the original Insomniac Spider-Man needed a month to patch that one in, but it's been a month and this basic feature is still nowhere on the horizon. There are no character bios, no ability to change the time of day in the endgame, no cops anywhere, although apparently they got flack for that in the first one. There's no in-game Spider-Man Twitter feed to peruse, no stealth or traversal challenges as mentioned. Only some of your special moves have upgrades, so you'll never want to equip the other supers available for those slots, and a set of the collectibles are completely hosed. As the game goes on, you'll hear podcasts from Jameson and a girl Danica giving their takes on in-game events, and yes, they'll still play long after the events in question if you play the story missions too fast like I did. The podcasts are interesting, they're fun, they're entertaining, they add depth to the game world, and they're gone forever after they play once. The last 2 games put the podcast in the collectibles so that you could revisit them or pick up on any that you missed, but now they don't. And given that the podcasts cut off if you trigger anything to do with any mission, you're going to miss a shitload of them and they never come back. And you might say that's all nitpicking, acceptable sacrifices if the game's a little rushed, but that doesn't even get into the glitches. I hesitate to call the game buggy because I just covered Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach where you can't turn a corner without finding problems, but the few bugs that I ran into were doozies. The game crashed 2 times, one of which was so severe that it broke the 4th wall to hard reset my entire console. Wraith turned invisible during her boss fight, which worked out. She'd been kicking my ass before she bugged the hell out. This poor sap needs somebody to chisel his head out of a solid brick wall, and that wasn't even the only time that I violated the city architecture. At one point, I knocked an enemy inside of a building, which meant I couldn't finish the mission because you have to kill all the enemies to proceed. Some of the costumes have capes, and the physics for the capes tend to get a little borked. I guess Roxanne Wolf has a phantom chest buddy now. One entire set of side quests is glitched since they end automatically if you start the encounter as Peter and just equip either of the black suits midway through the fight. For a while, the game started despawning crimes in progress almost right away, so I didn't have time to do them, even if the truck that I needed to save was 2 feet in front of my face, only to disintegrate before me. The animations riding a bike are more than a little messed up, and yes, they had time to program bike riding, but not more than a single combat mechanic. But the piece de resistance comes right here. See, the game has a recurring bug where your suit won't render properly, and I am not making this up. The bug turns you into a tiny white cube, and you can continue playing the game perfectly unhindered as the equilateral spider cube. I triggered the glitch and managed to play for a solid 4 minutes, cruising the city and responding to a crime before Spider Cube's existence destabilized the game world. Buildings turned invisible and began floating, I fell through the floor, and then the game crashed for a 3rd time. I almost want this cube to be added as an official costume, or at the very least to get a shout out in Beyond the Spider-Verse. Spider Cube, you don't wanna mess with the dude. Breaking worlds over here, 'cause he's a cube, not a goddamn sphere. I'll fear the wrath of the Spider Cube. Marvel Spider-Man 2 is a really good game, but because it's a sequel to 2 other really good games, and comes from a franchise with multiple really good games, I feel it's impossible not to grade on a curve of its place in the series. The story is phenomenal and a drastic improvement on Insomniac's first outing. The web swinging is probably my favorite of the series as a whole, but the combat and side content both took drastic downturns in quality, and it's just disappointing not to see improvement across the board. I've seen people lament that this is what we got after 5 years of development, but you got to remember, Insomniac also made the Miles Morales game in that period, and there was DLC for the first game, and they remastered the first Spider-Man for PlayStation 5, and the studio made a Ratchet & Clank game, and historically, developing for the major technological leaps of a new console generation tends to wreak havoc on dev teams. I think they were more crunched for time than we realize, in more ways than one. There's definitely a 3rd game incoming since they hardcore teased the Green Goblin, as well as, by my count, 4 other major characters for a sequel. And I seriously hope that both Sony and Insomniac give the next game the baking time it needs to tie the best of both worlds together into one truly sensational Spider-Man.
Nice! Yeah, we outside now.